Hello and welcome everyone to our latest experiment, the Harris Podcast. My name is Jeff Bender and I'm here to help you better understand who we are, where we are going, and to engage you in our journey. These podcasts are intended to introduce you to our leaders, our initiatives, and to new ideas and ways of thinking. Our goal is to not only inform you, but to engage you in helping us create the enduring organization. Please enjoy. Well, on this podcast, I'm going to be speaking with Mark Leonard, founder, president, and chairman of Constellation Software, our parent company. Mark founded Constellation in 1995, 25 years ago, using a less than memorable initial name in his business case and pitch, referring to it simply as Software Co. Over this 25-year period, Constellation has invested in over 500 businesses, now has more than $3 billion in net revenue, and more than 20,000 employees worldwide. CSI is currently organized into 6 operating groups, Harris being one of them. I've been fortunate to be able to work with Mark for over 20 years, watching him reinvent himself and continually challenge me to be a better investor and owner of the businesses we buy. Please join Mark and I as we get to know him a little bit better and understand how he thinks about our 2 areas of focus, being disciplined deployers of capital and great owners of VMS businesses. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Looking forward to it.
Now, I think to start with, which I know is an area you don't typically talk a lot about, but if you were from Harris, I typically will use my 3 kids for sure, and occasionally my wife to illustrate a point or to make a point. Do you sort of mind sharing with us sort of what your family situation is and what your kids are up to?
Family situation. Wow. My wife and I met in business school. She's French Canadian. She's the nicest human being that I know. Everyone adores her. She's kind and thoughtful and goes out of her way, and really, I would not have achieved anywhere near what I've achieved without her support and her taking care of the family. As you mentioned, have 4 kids. They're in their early 30s to mid 30s now, launched on their lives. We get along well. I'm visiting a couple of them right now out on the West Coast. I guess one thing I'm kind of surprised at how open people are about themselves and their families in this internet age, because nothing ever disappears.
Yeah, very
so it's. I learned early when I was in the venture business that whatever you say to third parties tends to get used in whatever way they wish to use it. And when I was in the venture business, I had a bad experience with the press, and that really put me off talking with them and made me very careful about what information about companies we shared, and we were very careful to create full messages. And even then, we recognized that you deliver a full message, which means that the journalist doesn't have to work particularly hard, and they can just take the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel, and use it and move on. You've got a good chance of getting that full message through. But if what they're doing is trying to be sensational, they will pick and choose and misuse whatever you deliver to them. And that kind of irresponsible use strikes me as the norm. And I find even when I look at internet chat groups of various kinds, the breadth of opinion and interpretation is extremely large. And so one of the things I try to do is insulate my kids from that. If they choose to be on the internet and known for particular things and create their own brand, and to some extent, some of them have in their particular realms, that's great. But I do warn them that you don't control what happens when it gets out there. So yes, I have 4 kids, and they're welcome to talk about how they live their lives on the internet or elsewhere.
Yeah, I find with using my kids, I find it can often be hard to become relatable to everyone, and I think I've found that using real life stories that I think a lot of people also experience and can relate to. I think also sort of helps whether it's talking to customers or to employees. So again, that's sort of a tool that I use that I think I found sort of helpful over the time, and certainly the feedback that I've received that people like it. But I do appreciate what you say, is that certainly anything you put out there can and will be used against you at someone else's choice and discretion, which is not always yours, for sure. Now,
So
I wanted to
just a quick observation on that. You're talking here about using storytelling and empathy as tools to communicate. And I think amongst our group of managers, you're the best I've ever seen. You're remarkable at it. And it can be a learned skill, and I encourage people to use it, because as humans we tend to relate to stories, and it's and certainly as we go through this, I'll try to find stories that illustrate sort of beliefs that I have and want to share. Hopefully, though, also beliefs that are grounded in fact and not fiction.
No, I appreciate that. I wanted to pick up on something that you actually mentioned on our last Constellation board call, and this I can't remember what we were talking about, or whether it was just we were all waiting to start the meeting. But you had mentioned, or I believe I heard you mention, that you had just bought a mortar mixer. Could you maybe provide a little bit more color on why someone such as yourself would be buying a mortar mixer and what you plan to do with
it? So I don't recall what it was, but it was probably sort of what we're doing in these COVID times that's out of the usual. So one of the jobs I had along the way was working as a mason's helper, and it was one of those things you do to make money. And as it turned out, it was a wonderful job for me. It was one where at the end of the day, you knew what you had achieved and you had a sense of accomplishment, and you knew that what you did would probably be still there in 100 years' time. So that was pretty cool work. And I could work as a mason when the seasons were good, and I'd figured out I could go to school on a semester type basis as opposed to full time. And so when I was collecting unemployment, I could go to 2 different schools part time, collect unemployment, and then once spring rolled around, I could go back to work as a mason. So I did that for several years, and I worked with a wonderful old mason. He was old as the hills, kind of a hobbit of a human being, small and stumpy and incredibly muscled old guy with a straw hat and a pickup truck that was about as old as he was, and tools that came from the Middle Ages. And he sort of taught me the trade. And I started off mixing mud and mortar for him, and then dressing stones, and eventually pointing stone walls, and then building stone walls. And it was idyllic. I would take my breaks and read wonderful literature, and then go back to being on a scaffold 3 stories up in the air, pointing a stone wall. It was just a remarkable time. I lived on a farm and had an old car, and one of my brothers came and lived with me and worked on one of the big mills we were redoing. So halcyon days, going to school, learning, reading, being healthy, and so I'm trying to recapture some of that. Maybe on weekends I can be Wally, the old mason, again.
That sounds very very aspirational. So can you share, so when you were reading literature, was there a sort of a writer or an author that you would tend to want to read more of their work?
At that time, I think I was reading John Fowles, who was a remarkably good writer, and John Barth, and those kind of folks. So it really was literature. It wasn't not ancient or classical literature, but modern literature.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Now, obviously, everybody who'll be listening to the podcast is obviously going through their own changes to their routines as a result of COVID-19. What do you find to be the biggest sort of difference to your sort of daily or typical routine that you've had to adjust to because of COVID?
Well, I think it's probably the same one that you've adjusted to, which is not being on an airplane. It's lovely, but at the same time, it's also a big change not to be schlepping out to the airport and spending time in airports and on airplanes. I do miss those sort of 7-hour flights to Europe where you get uninterrupted time. But the good side of COVID for me has been surrendering to good habits. So I work out more regularly. I sleep more. I eat better. It's been good.
Yeah, I have people ask me all the time. Do I miss traveling? And I think I'm still working. I think to figure out, back to you said, establishing new habits. And I've realized that a lot of my thinking time and even a bit of downtime happened when I was traveling, whether it was, again, you had spending time in the airport, spending time at hotels, really understanding how much I miss those long, like you said, 7, 8, if I was over to Israel, 10 or 12 hour flights to just kind of unwind, think, reflect, and do other things. Whereas now I find, the days are pretty standard and they sort of, they come and go pretty quickly. And I think it takes more of an effort to carve out that time to sort of be, again, more thoughtful and more reflective. So I keep working on that. So I've tried to create my Wednesdays now, where I try not to book too many meetings on a Wednesday, just to try and sort of give myself some time to think about those types of things. So do you have a morning routine? Like, do you is there sort of a typical way that you like to start each day?
I tend to wake up between 4 and 5 and have the same breakfast and read 2 or 3 newspapers. So yeah, it's pretty standard.
All right. So what newspapers do you read?
Because we're in Canada, the Globe and Mail is sort of the leading business newspaper, but for other employees around the world, you'll recognize the Financial Times from London, which I read. And if I've gotten through those two, I'll make my way into the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I know Jerry's a big fan of the Wall Street Journal. Doug Reed is a big reader of papers in the morning. He adds I think it's the South China News, I think, to his reading as well. He likes a little bit more of a global flavor. So he tells me. So I know that, or I understand that you have your Bachelor of Science, which I think is probably not super typical of a lot of the people that we have at Harris or Constellation. So why did you choose to study science, especially sort of given some of your what you just explained of your Mason work?
Yeah, and choose sounds so methodical. What I did was dabble. So I was in many different faculties and many different universities. And over a 7-year period, I eventually ended up with a 3-year science degree. In between, I played a lot of bridge and sports and tried a lot of different faculties.
You make me feel better now about giving my son grief about how long it took him, or one of my sons grief about how long it took him to get his degree. Then, if you could take 7, then perhaps I've misjudged what he might be able to accomplish with his. What was your sport of choice?
I played varsity basketball, varsity football, and varsity rugby, and rugby was by far and away my preferred sport.
Okay, interesting. Okay, all right. Now, back to your science degree. So, would you say that you use what you learned in your science program today at Constellation?
I think there's always something that you take from what you study, and I had one particular professor who had a impact upon me fairly late in my academic career, and I had a number of other profs who influenced me as well. But I think one of the characteristics of us as human beings is that our memories and knowledge has a half-life. So the stuff we learned 40 years ago, very little of it is being used by us today. We're constantly replacing what we know by what is currently correct and what we currently believe to be correct. So you've got to be a lifetime learner, and you've got to keep sort of filling your mind with new ideas and knowledge. And the old stuff becomes increasingly less relevant.
No, that's interesting. One of the books I read recently, forget the author's name now, but it was actually called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And one of the things that I took away, which I thought was interesting and it's caused me to sort of rethink how I go about testing the hypotheses that I put forward, which really is to move away from this test it to see if you're right, to really the scientific approach, which is focus on proving that it's actually wrong. And if you can't prove it's wrong, perhaps maybe it has some validity that you can take forward. Whereas I think a lot of us get caught into the paradigm of proving that we're right and just looking for anything we can find that proves that we're right, or once we hear something, we just want to believe that it's right, and that necessarily is not the best way to go about figuring out the right thing to do.
So, a well understood human frailty. It's called confirmation bias. And if you give people 10 pieces of data, they will look for the one that confirms what they want to believe, even if the other 9 say that they're wrong. A lot of that research on human bias was done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who Daniel got the Nobel Prize, actually for behavioral economics. He has written a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone called Thinking Fast and Slow. It came out about a decade ago, and it's probably the book I recommend most to people inside of Constellation and to our investors. It talks about basically the biases that we carry as humans and how we can, to some extent, understand those biases. It's very, very hard to actually truly counteract something like confirmation bias unless you frame the question in a different way, which is what you were suggesting. In other words, looking for ways to disprove a hypothesis rather than prove it.
Yeah, I read an article from Kahneman relatively recently, and I think somebody asked him about, given that he's studied it and he has, these theories on it, he's won the Nobel Prize, whether he still falls, subject to the same biases. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm no different than anybody else. He goes, I just might be a little bit more reflective on, sort of realizing it after the fact that I've actually, fallen, for the same biases, which I thought was very authentic of him, but very sobering to your point on sort of just understanding how we humans are actually wired to think and make decisions, for sure. So my final question for you, just on education, was, in your MBA, the course that you found most interesting and what it was that made it the most interesting for you.
And I saw in your notes that you wanted me to talk about this, and I racked my brain and couldn't think of a course that I actually liked in the MBA program. Partly that was because I went to a school that uses the case method, and hence they didn't really teach the principles, they taught the cases, and you were supposed to extract from the cases the principles, and they weren't always very good at doing that.
So would you recommend people, the MBA as a additional source of education and learning? Like, what's your thoughts on MBAs?
I think a blend of theory and cases is the ideal. And I think Western, the school I went to, was far too heavily case-oriented. The other challenge is that a lot of professors are not great teachers. So the most fun I had at Western was baiting the professors in the case method. They had the case notes and they knew what they wanted to extract out of, that 50 or 100-page tome that they had dumped on you, along with 3 others the night before to read. And as they ran the class, the greatest fun was sort of getting them off track and away from what they wanted to deliver, because they were frequently arrogant and poorly prepared group. And so that was probably my greatest joy at Western.
I'm sure they just loved you.
Yeah, a number of them did.
Yeah, I can imagine. So shifting over to work experiences, so I think you shared with us some of the masonry work you did and sort of what you found from that. Now, I read this somewhere, and again, I can't remember honestly where I read it, but it also said that you had 2 other what appear to be quite interesting jobs or things that you did. One being a grave digger and one being a bouncer. So I guess first is this true?
Yep.
Okay, and then any elaboration on digging graves or being a bouncer, or perhaps maybe how they've helped you see things differently today?
Not really. I mean, along the way, I was a municipal worker too, doing work in parks and painting fences and cutting weeds and all that other stuff. And I worked in a warehouse, and I was a draftsman, and I was a turnkey at a couple of major buildings. And I was a clerk at Canadian Tire, and I was in the reserve, and I moved furniture at night because that's when office moves tend to happen. And I did research on windmills. You kind of do what you need to do to survive, and you move on. And often that time isn't well spent, but it's something you don't have a choice about. You need the money, and you do, like I said, what you need to do. But at the same time, I think then if you're putting yourself through school or learning a particular skill which you eventually become good at, you prize that more highly because of the journey, because of the things that you had to do to get there. And I certainly sort of feel that way.
So what then? So if you sort of look at some of your early experiences, they definitely seem to be more physical in nature. Although if I reflect back on some of mine, they also would have been like that. Back to your point of you got to do what you got to do to pay your expenses, to pay for your education. And obviously, when you don't have a lot of skills and qualifications, that type of physical work tends to be more available. But the shift then from sort of using the physicality of your body to sort of earn income and do what you were doing to more sort of the intellectual pursuit of becoming an investor. Like how did that shift happen?
Yeah, I guess the MBA probably was the thing that took a hodgepodge of jobs and education and gave it direction. And once again, when I graduated, I took the job I had to take, which was a job in banking. But I was fortunate that I had a summer job between the years of the MBA where I had someone who is still a friend, coach me. And he basically sort of sized me up and said, I was working at a bank, a British bank called Barclays in Toronto. And he said, you will be a terrible banker. And why don't you go down to the files? We had all of these files. They were physical files. And read about the bank's clients and figure out where you'd like to work. And so for a portion of the summer, I did that. The other portion of the summer, I worked on a computer system for him with a spreadsheet type program that long predated and ran on many computers, Excel, and did modeling for complex leases, which was great fun. But the rest of the time, I read the files at Barclays, and I came across a venture capital company, one of the original sort of merchant banks that morphed into venture capital, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. So when I graduated, I tried to get a job in venture capital, but there was literally nothing in Canada. So I went to work for an American bank, and it happened to be one that had a large venture subsidiary. So I fought like hell to get into their US venture group, but failed and came back to Canada, still working for that American bank, and papered the inboxes of the whole venture community in Canada, got to know all the key people, went to their conferences, paying for it out of my pocket when my wife and I had no money, and eventually managed to crack the venture industry, got in. I was one of 400 applicants for a job that was advertised in the Globe and Mail. And that was how I started the venture career.
And what was it about venture capital that sort of, propelled you to be so tenacious to get into it?
I think once you've had all those jobs that you didn't want to have and that you had to have, the idea of a job that you really wanted was a really attractive thing. So that probably explains the tenacity, plus the support of my wife in pursuing it. What appealed to me was the stories and history of venture capital, the creation of wonderful companies that I knew of. And so I was really keen to be part of that. Now, once I joined the industry, I found it wasn't really that way, but from the outside, it looked very exciting. And it certainly attracted a group of really smart and driven people. So you had both variety and a sort of intellectual elitism that created a fatal attraction almost, from my perspective, to the industry.
And how long did it take you to realize that perhaps it wasn't what you wanted it to be?
So you get in and you're working with people, and they're not perhaps the people that you'd ideally like to be working with, and then you sort of reorient. And eventually I found my way to Ventures West, which was at the time the cream of the crop in the venture industry in Canada, and had some of the brightest folks I've ever worked with. They were absolute superstars, and they were ethical and hardworking and just remarkable human beings. And so it wasn't a people problem, and it wasn't the variety of the work problem, which was, it was astonishingly attractive. Within my personal portfolio within Ventures West, I had a group of photochemists that I worked with, and then another day I would get to work with the leading remote sensing technologists in the world. And I worked with a Dr. Frankenstein of the plant biotech industry, who was creating new plants by moving genes around. And it was absolutely fascinating. But after a while, You want to succeed with these things, not just sort of stumble along. And I think that need for mastery and focus and becoming really good at something drove me towards focusing on what ended up being Constellation Vertical Market Software and creating a permanent capital vehicle for the vertical market software industry, where you didn't have to buy and sell the businesses. You could keep them forever. You could build relationships that lasted a lifetime, and you could build businesses that were intent on being around as long as their clients were in existence. And that's a very different perspective than the venture industry, which, when it comes down to it, is all about creating things that you can sell to other people, either as IPOs or as outright sales. And so there's a different business model for the venture industry. And within Canada, at least, you couldn't focus narrowly enough in any particular segment that you could be a real specialist as a venture capitalist.
And so why vertical market software? Like, did you have experience with VMS when you were at Ventures West, or was this just something that you sort of came across as you were again looking to, master something and to apply this?
Yes, I did have a bit of experience with vertical market software, but the way I came to it as a path for a permanent capital vehicle and the place to focus wasn't because of any particularly fascinating technology. It was really because of a high quality business model. And what led me to thinking about high quality business models was one particular individual. Mm-hmm. So at one stage, as I was exploring venture capital and trying to figure out different ways to do it that might work, one of the ideas I had, hypotheses, was that you could back great horses instead of looking for particular races in which to run. And one of the horses I backed was a guy named Steve Scotchmer. And I worked with him for a number of years. He came from the advanced materials industry, looking for advanced materials companies that we could invest in and he could run. And he had a great track record, and he was a very thoughtful engineer. As I worked with him, I always found that his bar on business quality was extraordinarily high. He was looking for really, really great businesses. And we never succeeded in finding one that he wanted to invest his life in, and I wanted to invest the venture fund's capital in. But Steve had made some money from his previous venture, which got sold out from under him. And so he was also learning about investing. And as he was learning about investing, he was teaching me about investing. What he learned, he passed on to me, and he taught me about the great investors. And Buffett and Munger were certainly a big part of that. But there were also other people who influenced his investing philosophy as well, including some in Canada, who he introduced me to. So here I had started off as a venture capitalist. I was very tech-oriented, very much into science. And suddenly the person who has become the most important mentor in my life has sort of hauled me over to starting to think about really great business models and investing. And so I was pivoting and then looking back through the portfolio at Ventures West for these really great business models. I realized that a couple of the vertical market software things that we'd done were ideal, except they were small. they weren't ever going to be big businesses that warranted significant capital and could be a big enough canvas on which to work. So I came up with the idea of creating a holding company for such businesses. If they were great, small, medium-sized businesses, why not own a bunch of them? And that was the genesis of Constellation.
And when you took this idea back to the partners at Ventures West, did they look at you like you had three heads, or how did they, like, you know, what did they perceive of your idea?
It's interesting. They, as I mentioned, are really smart, driven people, and nearly all of them have this large total available market mindset. So big winner kind of approach to their thinking. It's what's taught in the venture capital business. But at the same time, they knew that what we were doing in Canada wasn't working particularly well. And so it was important to experiment and try other things. They enabled me to work on the idea. And then when we funded it, also provided some of the capital personally as individuals. And then when we took it public, many of them, I think all of them, became shareholders in the IPO as well.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I was not aware of that, actually. Okay, interesting. So why then? So as we're talking about, you know, going public and maybe just a bit pre-public. So why did you pick OMERS? And so for those listening, OMERS is the Ontario Municipal Employment Retirement Savings Plan. I think I got that right. As a partner, as a shareholder. So this is sort of the pre-public time. Why did you think they were a good partner? Like what was it you thought they brought to the table that you did not have or could not get on your own?
So I went out initially to a number of our entrepreneurial limited partners and to some high net worth individuals that I knew to raise capital, and I got some nibbles. And then I went to OMERS, who was our biggest limited partner at Ventures West, and talked to them. And they were interested, but not on conventional venture capital terms and not on terms that were very attractive to any other investor, so to speak. So I had a difficult choice. I could go the OMERS route and have my fundraising done alongside the money that the Ventures West partners were going to put in, or I could spend a considerable amount of time trying to drum up sufficient capital elsewhere and probably not have OMERS play because they had already dictated the terms on which they would play. And so I took the easy way out. I took the OMERS money, which was enabled us to get to 25 million Canadian, and launched the business and got on with it.
Okay, interesting. All right. So
there is one other thing that's probably relevant to your audience, and that's at OMERS, the person in charge of the group that invested in Constellation was someone I knew from business school. And so frequently you'll find that your acquaintances, your network are important. And he knew me really well. I knew him really well, and we trusted each other and liked each other. Now that worked out great, except that at some stage he became aware of some problems inside of OMERS and tried to get them sorted, and that put him politically in a difficult position, and he ended up leaving. And the people we ended up working with within OMERS were not a trusted relationship. the senior people, and so that's the reason why we sought another large investor. So you can have a good relationship with a single person inside of a large institution, whether it be a customer or a supplier, or in this case, a provider of capital. And if you lose that single point of contact, you really can be in a difficult position. So one of the things I did was diversify our sources of capital and managed to get TD Capital in, who later became Birch Hill, as our other major shareholder, private equity shareholder.
So if you look back on first partnering with OMERS, so do you think you would have done it if you didn't have the trusted relationship with the first individual that you had met at business school?
I don't think OMERS would have done it.
All right.
And would I have done it? I mean, I was probably naive enough to have taken the check, irrespective of the fact that I didn't know who I would have been taking it from at that stage.
All right. So Bernie Anzaruth is our chief investment officer and is employee number one, or he's number one or number two. How did you and Bernie meet and build a relationship that has survived 25 years, which I would say is, fairly unheard of these days? I think it's just a great story.
Yeah, it's. I'm trying to think back to the exact circumstances of how we met. Firstly, Bernie was employee number two. I am employee number one because Ventures West leaned on me and said, you should have a CFO. And so I went out and got one. And that, by the way, is a good lesson also. If you lean on people to do something, they generally comply without doing it the way they would want to do it. And so employee number one ended up leaving us fairly quickly. Bernie was an analyst for us, and I hired him into Ventures West because that was a whole lot easier to do than hiring into Software Co., which was not a household name at the time. And Ventures West was a reasonably well-known venture group, and Bernie was a new grad from INSEAD, or relatively new grad from INSEAD. He was obviously very bright. He had a technical background, international experience, and like most hires, it's a crapshoot. When we hire from the outside into senior roles, I think we've around a 50% success rate. So it's not easy. In this particular instance, I work closely with Bernie, and you're either going to end up developing respect or indifference or contempt for the person. And we were lucky. We ended up respecting each other, and it's been a great relationship the whole way through. Literally can't think of any major arguments we've had along the way, and we've, I think, thoroughly enjoyed working together.
No, it is a great story that I think anybody again who works with people that closely, I think would cherish the opportunity to have built such a great relationship. So you took Constellation public in 2006. Why take the company public?
The capital we'd raised in 95 didn't really have a ticking clock on it because it was from a pension fund. But the capital we raised from Birch Hill definitely had a ticking clock on it. Their fund was a 10-year fund, or At least I assume it was. Most of the venture funds were. And so I knew I had to find them an exit at one stage. And what tends to happen with private equity firms is if you don't find them an exit, they find themselves an exit. And that usually involves whistling in some iBankers to dress you up for sale and then running an auction. So going public was one of the routes to get an exit. And so we explored it and executed it. It wasn't particularly tough. We had a reasonable story to tell. We weren't raising a lot of capital. I guess the only peculiarity was the capital we did raise. We raised by selling shares on behalf of OMERS and Birch Hill.
Yeah, meaning the Constellation did not raise any equity itself that went into the company. It was just for the selling shareholder.
Yes, exactly. It was solely for liquidity for those shareholders. Yeah.
No, any regrets having gone public? So obviously, like to your point, you felt it was something you had to do given the capital structure. But now, you can reflect back, and it's been at 14 years. I mean, any regrets on being on that decision?
No. I mean, the one thing I would counsel anyone who's taking a company public, and we are going to be spinning out a company shortly from within Constellation. The only advice I give you is to pick your shareholders if you can, and to work at attracting those shareholders that you think you'd like to be associated with for the long term.
Did you find that more difficult now? I think if you look before, I think you used to publish in some of the shareholders letters. I had gone back and read a bunch before in preparation for this chat. And you talked about sort of what started off as relatively low turnover in our shares. So people were not buying and selling shares in Constellation very often, and that number was sort of creeping and creeping and creeping. I haven't seen the latest number, but so are you still happy with the cohort of our major shareholders today?
We have some shareholders who are long-term shareholders, but that cohort is much smaller than it ever was. And increasingly, the index funds have become a big and important part of what we do here at Constellation.
Yeah, I would definitely that you said, like, and the bigger we get, I think the more that tends to happen, right? Because now we actually are on the radar or in the requirements for many different funds for sure. So I wanted to go back to a comment you had touched briefly on, this sort of hiring from within when we were talking about when I had asked you the question about Bernie and so I think to your point, I think our success rate of bringing in certainly senior leaders from outside of Constellation, I think as you put it, is about a 50-50 hit rate or success rate, which is not really great when you're thinking about the impact and how long we want to have employees with us. So it's not a great track record. Any sense? I mean, your sense of whether we should continue to focus on just creating better paths for people within Constellation to move up to more and more senior levels, or try and understand and be better at bringing in external people for some of the benefits that they would bring when they come?
It's a tough one. It's I would rather hire high quality talent with a long runway and then develop them internally and give them a rapid development path than try and go outside and bring in people who are ready to slot into some relatively senior role. And that's partly because I think what we do is different. I think we're very unusual. Firstly, you don't get many vertical market software companies that are of scale and that play in multiple verticals and that do what we do. that are very investment savvy and return on capital employed oriented, while at the same time thinking about the very long term. And so I'd much rather get someone who's smart, has had a job or two, knows what working is like, and knows something good when they see it, and then introduce them to Constellation, and hopefully they find what they're looking for in a place like Constellation.
Yeah, no, you're saying it's definitely a tough one. I think when you sort of look at, again, our lack of success, but then you also, I think, one of the things I've been struggling with lately is infusing existing thinking and ways of doing things with new and different thinking. Because I find a lot of times we just, we've convinced ourselves, we tell ourselves the same narrative, the same story, and we believe it. And over time, it's not that the story might change totally, but it definitely changes. And I think sometimes we're not as quick or as fast as we need to be to adjust. And I think sometimes balancing the individuals that you described with, again, bringing in some other people, I think with just different ways of looking at things, different ways of thinking, I think could strike a nice balance between us, finding ways to be more successful with the businesses that we own. I'm doing some work now with a company outside of Constellation, and they have a metric. I haven't quite figured out, again, how well they score this metric, but they look for 25% of their leaders. Now, again, I didn't define what leader meant, but they either want new promotions from within or people brought in from the outside. They want 25% of their leaders to be different in each year. And the idea behind it is really to, again, drive different thinking, bring a sort of a different focus, a different drive and momentum to keep moving forward, which I thought was an interesting way to looking at it versus sort of always being sort of doing the same old thing the same old way just because that's how we've always done it. So it's an interesting concept for sure.
Yeah, it reminds me of General Electric, where you knew you had your job for 3.7 years, and you were always thinking about what that next job was. And in your 3.7 years, you were keen to, hit all your objectives, make your boss happy, have good reviews, and get a better next job. And that led to tremendous success for General Electric. Everyone was on the same bus. But I think it also led to a lot of short-term thinking and over-optimization. And eventually, I think it led to book cooking and unethical behavior that got them into trouble. And that's one of the fears of not living with the results of the decisions you make today and their implications for 5 to 10 years down the road. In the software business, as we all know, the investments you make in R&D and sales and marketing today in new initiatives probably aren't going to pay off for that 7 to 10 years.
So how do you? So I think this is probably an area where you and I are probably not as aligned as we might be on some other topics. So how then do you how do you think about individuals as they come up wanting to do more and different things, being able to do those things that might require them to be separated from some of these decisions?
So the way I've handled that, as you know, is that I don't take people out of a position where they own something. I just create situations where they own more stuff. And so you were responsible for Harris, and you're now responsible for Harris, the original utility business. You're now responsible for so much more. And that only works if the people have the capacity to keep on going. But if I'd taken you and convinced you to go off and run Gary Jonas when I needed managers there and to leave Harris behind, I think we would have lost something, that intimate knowledge that you built up of the people, the customers, the products within the utility space, which I believe would have been a loss for the Harris Operating Group. Now, one of the things that I believe is that ideas and practices travel in people, absolutely. And so new people can bring new ideas. But I also believe that there's a group of people, and it's not everyone, who are natural consumers and adopters and observers of new ideas. And if you have enough of those, you don't need to bring in people from the outside. Now, I've no objection to bringing people in from the outside, but I prefer to bring in doers as opposed to managers, so to speak, people who install processes or help those things happen rather than people who hire, fire, set incentive compensation, things of that nature. And what I find is when people talk about hiring outsiders, they're rarely talking about people who bring Pareto processes or digital marketing processes or whatever process it is. They're really talking about bringing in technical specialists in particular realms. They're usually talking about bringing in general managers.
No, that's very true. So switching topics a little bit to, I think, what I would consider to be sort of one of the foundations of the Constellation and the Harris business model, which really is, decentralization, autonomy, and control, typically at the business unit level, so being core to our DNA. Obviously, this originated with you. What experience in your life or in your work experience, where did this come from?
You're talking about autonomy as a concept?
Yeah, and sort of, I would say, a lot of people, I think, when we talk, I find, if they find our level of decentralization and control that we put at our business unit levels almost to be extreme, and don't really understand why we don't, focus on synergies and trying to do a lot more things, right? So I would say that the model that we follow is not very common or well understood when we try and explain it.
So it starts with a personal preference. I don't like anyone telling me what to do. I love being convinced. I love changing my mind. It's the neatest feeling in the world to have someone take you from a position in which you're entrenched and believe that you understand your position and have you be convinced otherwise through a rational process. I get a little tingle when that happens. It's wonderful. But I don't like anyone saying, I am an authority figure and you will do it this way. I can barely think of anything that annoys me more. And that's just upbringing. I grew up, I got strapped by the principal. I challenged teachers. I left home early. I had a bootleg radio license. I built a flamethrower. I did things that weren't acceptable to lots of people. And that ability to choose what I think is right and to defend that position, if I can, is something I prize highly. I love those license plates, live free or die. And so I hope that we've been able to attract people who feel similarly. I certainly see an incredible sense of independence amongst the people with whom I work directly. I don't know if you feel there's a lot of sycophants around that manager table, Jeff, but I certainly don't think so.
No, I mean, obviously, when you describe, I think sort of why you believe what you do, and I think people have a hard time understanding that you truly do live that. I think, I can't remember, we've worked together for 20 years. And again, I don't think I could, I'd have to think really hard. And I think even if I did, I don't think I'd come up with anything where you actually told me to do something. You have often tried to persuade me. You have often provided, evidence and suggestions and recommended, conversations with others to try, to your point, to get me to see things differently or to use a different lens, for sure. But I mean, I'm not sure I could ever tell you a time where, you told me to do something. And that's, when we were a small business, or now, that we are the size that we are. I think, though, when I reflect, though, and I guess my question for you then is, does it upset you, though, that I probably don't live it the same way that you do? Right? That I do try and, I do believe in autonomy and decentralization, and I do try and empower our leaders to do, to make their own decisions and to learn, and even often, sometimes let them, fail and, learn from mistakes. But there will be an occasion where I will step in and probably require them to do something, or perhaps they would feel that I am not giving them an alternative. Well, I might, maybe I'm pretending that I am, but I'm not. Does it bother you that I don't always live it the same way you do?
Not at all. And that's self-serving on my part. So if you do something different, and Mark Miller does something different, and Dexter does something different, we're always in a position where if it works, we're all going to know. You're going to share that, right? Yeah. And that experimental approach to life is one that makes for a much healthier whole. Evolution is a natural process. Some things are going to work, some aren't. If you're not experimenting, if you're not trying to do things differently, we aren't going to discover the right way forward. So I'm delighted that you are trying different things and you don't necessarily sign up for the whole package.
I was going to transition actually into experimentation and best practices. And I think, when we look across, one of our core strengths is our ability to share best practices, not only with, the businesses within a Harris group, across Harris, but also across CSI. And I think, despite the fact that when it comes to deploying our capital, there's definitely a level of competition amongst the operating groups. When it comes to that, I think we've still done a really good job of still sharing our best practices of, to your point, what works, what doesn't work. I think that's been one of our core strengths, and something that I keep fighting to make sure that we keep doing. But do you think we do a good job at sharing best practices? Like, when you stand back and you look at what we're actually doing, do you believe we're still doing it like we used to?
So firstly, the nature of our best practices is really important. When Newton discovered physical laws, those could be replicated everywhere, in every geography, in every time. But when we discover best practices, when we try to replicate them in a different geography or a different time or a different industry, they don't always work. You can't always replicate them. Much of what we do is context sensitive. It doesn't apply. It may send you off in the right direction, but you can't apply it like a law. And so our best practices are vague and fuzzy recipes that send you in a particular direction. You can't put them in a 3-ring binder and ship them off to Brazil. And hence, I'd much rather they traveled in the form of, why don't you talk to so-and-so over at this business unit about that particular thing? And so some of my time is spent with Robin saying, we got approached by a supplier. He wants to put up the prices by 10 times for this software component that we use. How do we handle that? Who should we talk to? And I'll reach out to some people and try and find someone for him, often by phoning you, who in turn say, well, why don't you talk to so-and-so, and etc. So that sort of organic, have you seen a situation like this before? It looks like this. Here's someone to talk with, is how we often share best practices. And it's because of the nature of the best practices we're sharing. Now, does that get harder as you get bigger? Absolutely. And so do you need to invest ever more in providing network and contacts and institutional knowledge to people? Yeah. Now, the fact that I can't connect Robin's person who has this issue down in one of his business units directly to someone inside of Dexter's unit that has this issue doesn't bother me hugely, because I know that within Robin's unit, there'll be some advice from some business unit that will help that person. And so the fact that the network gets a bit frail as you get a bit bigger doesn't mean that the units inside of TSS, Robin's unit, aren't as strong as they were inside of all of Constellation 10 years ago. So I still think we can have robust best practice activities in our smaller portfolios or operating groups that are as good as they ever were, and that the things that filter through you and me, Jeff, will just be fewer, and hopefully there'll be bigger issues and more important things that we can actually help with.
I do spend my time. It actually is on connecting people, like you said. Talk to so and so. Have you seen so and so? It really actually is. I find I spend more time there than I probably have in the past, which I find actually quite rewarding when you link the people together and then you follow up on the conversations. It can be quite impactful for sure. So you've done a bunch of research, which you've shared with certainly myself and my peers, and also with the Constellation Board of Directors on HPCs, or high performance conglomerates, sort of looking at what can we learn from others who sort of at least have the organizational structure that we have. So why bother studying what others have done if they actually aren't in vertical market software in all cases?
I think I studied around a dozen of the high-performance conglomerates. And the neat thing is that one of them was a vertical market software company. It was Jack Henry, still is. And the other one, Roper, was busy becoming a vertical market software company. So, to have the 12 best high-performance conglomerates in the world, 2 of them end up as vertical market software companies, is pretty damn remarkable. And sort of speaks to the fact that it is an inherently good business. That said, the other 10 or so were not high performance vertical market software conglomerates. They were just in other industries and businesses. And the reason to study them is to try and figure out how we as Constellation are going to evolve. If there was an obvious group of companies that I could look to that showed the way, that had many, many acquisitions, that had continued to be successful over time, I would have gone to them. This was just sort of where I ended up when I couldn't find anyone who looked more like us within our industry.
Was there a learning that sort of crosses many of them that surprised you most?
It's not a learning that is unique to them, but it's the sort of reversion to the mean thing. This is a concept that people talk about all the time. Whenever you get exceptional performance, it tends to diminish over time towards mean performance. And we certainly saw that in all of the high performance conglomerates. They all started out with extraordinary returns on capital once they figured out what they were doing. And then gradually over time, for instance, the returns on capital started to diminish.
And you mentioned Jack Henry. What is it about them that impresses you the most? I remember actually when I first joined Harris, you were talking about Jack Henry, which is it's a long time ago.
Yeah, in fact, Bernie wrote a piece on Jack Henry way back when you joined, that we still have lying around, which is kind of fun to go back and look at. I went on a road trip at one stage and met Jack as he was a very old and sick man, and had the opportunity to have dinner with him at his house. And he was a character and very kind to see me when he was in such a state. The thing I loved about Jack Henry, and is startling even today, is that they compete in an industry where the customer base has become much, much less over time. They're probably half the number of small financial institutions in the United States now that there were when we first looked at them. And despite that, they have grown their revenues, profits, earnings per share, shareholder value at a remarkable rate for since the early 80s, I believe, when they went public. So that's an incredible track record.
Now, one of the things that they typically do, or I think they've done a better job than we have, is sort of using their channel, their existing customers, to basically then purchase add-on products or even potentially service offerings, and then take that back into their existing customer base. Like we talk about that. I mean, certainly my comment here might be more Harris specific. We haven't done that as often as I think I would like to see us do. Like, any sort of sense as to, you think, why we don't do that more often? Like it seems like, from a return perspective, it seems like something where we should be spending more time. And any sense as to why you think we might struggle with doing that?
I'm thinking that you could identify right now 3 or 4 companies in the utility software space that you would like to own if price were no object.
Yeah.
And I don't think Jack Henry let price be an object. So they paid up for the acquisitions that they bought. And because they paid up, they had to have synergies. They had to do cross-selling. They had to achieve some things with those assets that when we take our capital and go out and invest in some new vertical that isn't utilities, we don't have to do. And if you look at Constellation's results, we generate a higher return on our capital than Jack Henry does. Now, if we were seeing lower rates of return across the board, or if we used a lower hurdle rate, I believe we would own more utility software businesses, because I think you would have stretched and found a way and driven for synergies and done cross-selling and all those other things to enable you to be more strategic about what you do as opposed to opportunistic about what you do. You would have ended up in less verticals. You would have had lower returns on capital, but you probably would have built within utilities a higher market share business with a larger moat around it than your existing businesses, which are still pretty extraordinary businesses. Do you think that's a fair reflection?
Yeah, no, I'm sitting here thinking. So I think the answer is yes. But then do you consider then Jack Henry to be less disciplined deployers of capital than we are? I guess when you look at pure return, I guess the answer is simple. The answer is yes. But the question is, who's created more value?
Oh, I think we've created more value.
Yeah.
By a long shot. But they've created astonishing amounts of value, returned a lot of capital to shareholders. We haven't returned a huge amount of capital to shareholders. I mean, it's not trivial, but we've redeployed more capital.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, this concept of, what would the businesses look like? How deep would the moats actually be if we if we had, you said, a different approach? And I do think I do agree with you that they would be much deeper, more diversified. But likely, you're right. The consequences, second order, third order consequences, the returns would likely also be lower. It's a very interesting way to look at it. That's probably actually a good segue into which I think will be of interest to a lot of our businesses, which is this profitability organic growth trade-off. That's something that we often speak to. You've written before, I think it's a quote from one of the shareholders' letters, that that you believe organic growth is the toughest management challenge in software. So why do you believe that? Why do you believe that organic growth is the toughest management challenge in software?
It started out with my experience in the venture business, where we were looking to create new businesses, new markets, new products, and it proved incredibly difficult. And we then, inside of Constellation, did a long empirical study of our own initiatives over a 5-year period and demonstrated to ourselves that we too were doing a poor job of deploying capital in new initiatives. And I knew it was tough, but it wasn't until I came across Philip Tetlock's research that I understood why it was tough. So Tetlock is the most famous researcher in the area of forecasting, and wrote a book, and I hate the name of the book because it sounds like hype, called Super Forecasters.
Yeah.
But I love his research, which I had come across before the book. And his original PhD took forever because he followed a series of gurus and forecasters and people who claimed to be visionaries and know the future, who were making statements publicly that he could then track as to the accuracy of their forecasts and visions. And these were economists, they were political analysts, they were all kinds of people. And eventually, when he managed to compile all the research, he published an article that got a fair amount of press, and along with him, his PhD, that the average guru was no better than a dart-throwing chimp at forecasting the future. And as his profile and people got to know him, the US government took an interest in his research and provided him with significant funding to extend his work on forecasting, which he did, and which led to a lot of the work in the Super Forecasters book, And the outcome of that is that there are, it turns out, a tiny group of people who are capable of good forecasts. Now, it's important to understand what Tetlock means by a good forecast, and the kind of people that are good forecasters. And I won't go into that here, but if you're tempted, it's definitely a good book to read. And you can also find some articles that encapsulate what's in the book. But the main finding that you won't find advertised in a whole lot of places, because it isn't really the thesis of his book, but has tremendous relevance for us, is that even the best forecasters, his super forecasters, can do a good job out maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. But there are no super forecasters who can forecast 5 years and 10 years. They don't exist. So visionaries are people who either say a lot of different things and one of them works out and then they get known for it, or they're the person who says something outlandish and we happen to end up with an outlandish event, and then they become known as being a visionary. So unless you have this ability to see far out into the future, how do you make long-term investments? Well, it's incredibly difficult stuff. And the most obvious way you can do it is by listening really closely to your customers. So instead of you making forecasts, you let your customers be your co-developers. And it's one of the ways that we've been able to improve what we do on the initiative side. And we have a variety of techniques that we use for doing so. One of the high-performance conglomerates that we studied was Illinois Toolworks, and it took co-development to the extreme, working with clients to actually get patents jointly that were owned by ITW, Illinois Toolworks, and the client. So co-development is one of the great ways to develop products that you know will have a market, rather than just forecasting that there will be demand for them.
And do you think there's a reason why, or do you think there's something we could do better to support our leaders and our businesses to be willing, I guess, to take more risk, to find these potential ways to drive organic growth? You know, realizing sort of again that it's not going to be, you know, decision today, growth tomorrow scenarios. I struggle with just trying to get them to, you know, people to think a bit more longer term and being willing to make some of the shorter term trade-offs to be able to drive it. I just think it gets harder and harder. I find as the businesses grow and even realize a little bit of success, they become less risky. I find they become more risk averse.
Yeah, and you and I and various other people, and Mark Miller's had a big hand in this, have come up with some rules of thumb. One is that you need a full-time champion for a particular initiative. It can't be something that people do in their part-time. Otherwise, you know, making the week, making the quarter becomes the overriding priority, and you never get around to working on the initiative. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I have a dozen initiatives running personally, and I always get roped into the treadmill of quarterly stuff. So having dedicated champions and ideally dedicated teams is your best way to go about this, and then separating the financials for those dedicated initiatives from your core business so that your core profitability is still obvious and is still the everyday concern of whoever is running those core activities, is an important part of what we do and try to do. Now, one of the problems is that initiatives that are small don't easily fall into that paradigm of a full-time initiative champion and a separate team who can work on the initiative. And so I think there's a certain minimum scale that you need to make this kind of approach work well. The idea of trying to run initiatives with 5% of your time or 10% of your time or 20% of your time, and, this is Friday, therefore I work on initiatives. I haven't seen it work anywhere. I've heard people talk about it, but I haven't heard that it is a permanent and satisfactory process.
No, I would agree with you. I think we call it the grind. The grind of the business will suck all away or suck away most of that oxygen for any of those types of things. If you're not I often talk to our leaders and employees about when you wake up in the morning, you're going to be a lot more successful if you know exactly what you're focused on. So I think that applies to initiatives as well, as opposed to waking up in the morning trying to saying what is it I'm supposed to do today. That can be a much less effective way to go about doing things if you're trying to achieve something specific, or something that definitely takes more than a few cycles of time, for sure.
I think it'll be fascinating to observe Topicus, the company that TSS is just buying. This is a company that has over 1,000 employees, that has grown organically without outside capital, largely through initiatives. And so trying to understand it better is one of my high priorities over the course of the integration period, the next year or two, and share some of those best practices if possible, and encourage some of their key managers to contribute ideas and approaches to the rest of Constellation.
No, and I think having Robin and his team, who I think have done, in a relatively short period of time, I guess it's not that short anymore, they've been around for a while, but I've always been so impressed by his willingness to embrace best practices and share them. Even to this day, I would say they still, I think, do probably one of the best jobs across Constellation of sharing best practices, having their leaders attend, and interact with other businesses and do that. They've been actually very helpful for us as we've been sort of digging into some of our M&A business development functions. They've been, more than willing to share and what they're doing, what's working. More importantly, what hasn't worked. You might not want to do this because we tried it and it didn't work. They've been great. So I think if anybody can grab that value, which would be tremendously valuable for all of us, I do think Robin and his team are a great group to do that. And actually, speaking of Robin and his team, and I would also say Mark and his team at Volaris. So one of these other things I think that you talk about, where again, you and I may not always be fully aligned, is so while you'll readily admit that the data doesn't fully support smaller sized businesses. So basically, this means a business unit that keeps its scale somewhat reduced, and therefore potentially then you need to consider breaking up larger business units into into one or two or several smaller business units, versus the opposite of folding larger ones in. Why do you believe that's so important? And again, my thought here was obviously that I think Mark at Volaris and both Robin at TSS have done some really good things with breaking up some of their larger businesses into smaller businesses and seeing some good results. So why do you what's your sort of your sense as to why small is better than large?
My early experiences in the venture business were sort of part and parcel of that. And if you go back even further, it relates to my experiences playing team sports. I adored team sports. To me, it was it was life-changing when I got to school and started playing team sports. I love that environment. I love the level of intensity that came out of it. I love great coaches who could extract incredible performances from, a bunch of relatively inept players such as myself. And when I got into the venture business, it was almost expected that people would be investing themselves into their job at a level of energy and enthusiasm that you just don't see inside of your average corporation, except in a few highly motivated, ambitious generally managers or salespeople. So that sort of all hands on deck, the whole team trying to help things succeed that you see in the average venture-backed company. I saw in some of the early businesses at Constellation. Trapeze, for instance, was like that. And I no longer see that at any of our businesses. I told the story of turning up for an early meeting at one of our businesses and getting in there and sitting in the carrels waiting for the managers to arrive and listening to the chat amongst the employees as they drifted in. And they weren't coming in early, and they weren't buckling down, and they weren't excited about work, but I certainly got to hear a lot about their personal lives. And it was just so different than the early days of Volaris, of Trapeze. And the intensity was so diminished. I was so disappointed. And I'm convinced it's a function of size. It's, a reversion to the mean. You're not going to have those high performance teams when you get extremely large. Now, those are personal observations, and there is some really good research. So when you want to look at high output teams, there's been research done since the 1800s on this topic. I'm talking about scholarly research. And what you'll see is that as you add people to a team, a small team, you get diminishing output per person. And there are terms for this like social slacking and things of that nature. And when you have complex work activities that require coordination between teams, there are other factors that diminish output per team member. And communication overhead is one example. It's an n minus 1 factorial, where n is the number of nodes in a network. The amount of communication overhead builds close to geometrically as you add people to a team. And from what we can see over time, technology has not been particularly good at making team size increase effectively. Then there are sort of empirical observations on efficient team size. If you look at agile teams in the software world, what you'll find is team sizes from 6 to 9, maybe 5 to 10 are most common. And that seems to be the right sort of span for teams. Now, you can obviously stack 5 to 10 person teams one over another and have one person from the team above oversee the team below, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that for sure works. But what happens is the distance from the top of the stack to the bottom of the stack becomes increasingly large. And so the knowledge of what's happening in the field becomes increasingly distant, and the empathy with the field person and the person at the top of the stack becomes increasingly distant. And I just feel that if you get much beyond that sort of 50 to 100 level, you start substituting systems for knowledge and systems for empathy. And systems, by their very nature, tend to be bureaucratic and one size fits all. And so you start not looking for and working with the slightly warped and stunted, but enthusiastic and perhaps brilliant average employee, and start working instead with the ideal employee who is a figment of your imagination because they don't exist. And you end up with a sort of lowest common denominator ideal employee, which leaves an awful lot of untapped resource in the organization. So once again, this isn't particularly research backed, but I'm personally willing to trade off the inefficiencies of not having larger scale for the autonomy of a small, tight, agile team. Now, I don't know if this is an instance where I have confirmation bias, but I have a feeling that within Topicus, what we're going to find is a lot of the initiatives that have been the drivers of success of the growth of that business have been relatively small teams that eventually over time end up growing to become big to take advantage of the opportunity. But in the early throes of the opportunity development, had a few extraordinary people on a small team.
So is the trade-off then, Mark, when you talk about sort of the efficiency, you think is it profitability that you're trading off, or like what, or just overall market size, market share? Like what is that, like what's the trade-off you think? Like what is the inefficiency?
The inefficiency is probably both market size for a particular, well, here's an example of how I would take a market of X size. If you ran it with one BU, I think you would probably get higher margins and higher revenues per person, and the market would grow at X rate. If you took that same market and addressed it with 3 BUs, my gut feeling is that you'd get lower margins, but you'd eventually end up addressing more needs of the marketplace. And so you'd end up with gross revenues that were higher. You'd have lower revenues per person and lower margins, but I think you'd grow faster, you'd build a bigger moat, and you'd have more long-term revenues.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. Actually, comes to mind because actually we just Jerry actually just did something with one of our larger healthcare businesses where we broke 2 pieces of it off and actually brought in a new EVP to create a new business. But like you said, that the short-term consequence is certainly to profitability, but I think the long-term is giving this new business the oxygen and the ability to grow and to try and do something and not be weighted down by the larger business for sure. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and thank you very much for so much of your time today. I really appreciated that, and thank you for your very thoughtful and considered answers. And thank you very much.
It was great to do it, Jeff, and always look forward to talking, admittedly indirectly with your employees, and encourage any of the managers who report up to you to reach out to me if you'd like to have a similar sort of conversation about any topic, really. Thanks.
Perfect.
Okay, cheers. Bye.